The morning Mabel Cross was supposed to get married, she burned the biscuits. She'd been up since before dawn, moving around her small room at the back of the Calloway boarding house, with the particular kind of nervous energy that doesn't let a person sit still. She'd set a pan of biscuits near the stove because she thought eating something might settle her stomach. And then she'd gotten distracted pinning the last section of lace at her collar and forgotten all about them until she smelled the char. By then they were black on the bottom, pale and doughy in the middle. Not fit for anyone. She scraped them into the slop pail, washed her hands, and told herself it didn't matter. Nothing about this morning was supposed to go wrong in any way that counted. The dress was finished. She'd sewn it herself, which was either a point of pride or a thing to be embarrassed about, depending on who was doing the judging. She'd started it 3 months ago when Franklin Holt had asked her to marry him in the back room of his dry goods store, his voice low and oddly hurried, his eyes not quite finding hers. She told herself the nervousness was endearing. She told herself a lot of things. The fabric was pale blue cotton, not silk, she couldn't afford silk, with small white buttons down the front that she'd sourced from a traveling merchant who'd come through Red Hollow in early spring. She'd taken in the waist 3 times, let it back out twice, and finally accepted that her body was the shape it was. The dress fit her. That was the most accurate thing she could say about it. It was clean, it was pressed, and it fit her body, which was full and broad and had been the subject of commentary in this town since she was old enough to understand what commentary meant. Mabel Cross was 26 years old and had lived in Red Hollow her entire life. Her mother had died when she was 11, and her father, a surveyor with a talent for land work and a weakness for bad luck, had followed 8 years later. Not dramatically, not in any story worth telling, but slowly, the way men sometimes do when the work gets harder than the body can manage. She'd been on her own since she was 19, taking in sewing and alterations, making enough to keep her room at the boarding house and not much else. She was not beautiful in the way Red Hollow understood beauty. She knew this not because anyone had been cruel enough to say it plainly, though some had when she was younger, but because of the particular quality of silence that followed her into rooms, the way women's eyes moved over her and then away, the way men at the saloon didn't bother to stop their conversations when she walked past. She was the kind of person a town learns not to notice, and she had spent years trying to take up less space, speak more quietly, want less, as if by making herself smaller in every way that wasn't physical, she could compensate for the body she hadn't chosen. Franklin Holt had noticed her, or had seemed to. He was 31, decent-looking, ran the dry goods store his uncle had left him. He wasn't a warm man, but he was steady, and steady had seemed like enough. When he'd asked her to marry him, she'd felt something release in her chest that she hadn't even known was held tight. She'd said yes before he finished the sentence. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand now. Her hair was pinned up, a few dark curls loose at her temples. Her face was flushed. The dress sat across her shoulders in a way that was better than she'd expected. She picked up her small bouquet, wildflowers she'd gathered herself from the slope behind the mill because she hadn't wanted to ask anyone for help with them, and walked out into the morning. Red Hollow's church sat on the north end of Main Street, a plain wooden building with a bell that didn't always ring true. By the time Mabel arrived, the pews were already filling. She'd asked Dottie Marsh, the boarding house keeper's daughter, to walk with her, and Dottie had agreed in the easy, slightly distracted way she agreed to most things. They came in through the side entrance and waited in the small vestibule where the air smelled of old wood and something close to dust. "You look fine," Dottie said, not unkindly. She was checking the back of her own hair in the small mirror hung crooked on the vestibule wall. "Thank you," Mabel said. Through the crack in the door she could see the pews. She recognized most faces. This was a small town and she had lived here her whole life. The Hennessy family near the front, old Bart Cutler who delivered mail on Thursdays, the women from the quilting circle who had never once invited her to join. She saw Franklin's mother in the second row, a thin woman with an expression that had never, in Mabel's experience, suggested approval of anything. She didn't see Franklin. That wasn't unusual yet. Grooms sometimes came in through the back. She didn't let herself worry about it. Reverend Dallow appeared at the far end of the vestibule, adjusting his collar, his expression the careful blankness of a man who has presided over enough human events to have learned not to show too much of anything in advance. "Miss Cross," he said, "we'll begin shortly. Is Franklin? He'll be along. Dallow said, and moved away before she could ask anything else. She waited. The murmur of voices on the other side of the door shifted and settled. A baby somewhere made a short, irritated sound and was hushed. The morning light coming through the single small window in the vestibule was pale gold and clean, and Mabel thought for just a moment that whatever happened after today, this particular moment was all right. She was standing in good light in a dress she'd made herself, holding flowers she'd picked, and the day had not yet gone wrong. Then she heard the door. Not the front door of the church, the side door, the one that led to the alley behind the building. It opened and closed quickly, and a moment later Bobby Cutler, Bart's youngest son, appeared in the vestibule. He was 16 and had a face that had never learned to hide anything. He looked at her. Then he looked at the floor. "Miss Cross," he said, "Mr. Holt sent me." She heard later that several people in the front pews saw her face change in the seconds before she came through the main doors. She didn't remember her face doing anything. What she remembered was a specific muffled quality descending over everything, like putting her head underwater, the way sounds changed and slowed. "He's not coming," Bobby said. He said he can't do it. He said to tell you he's sorry." The boy was miserable. "He left on the morning stage. I don't know where he went." Mabel stood very still. "He left," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the door to the main church. On the other side of it, maybe 60 people were sitting in pews waiting for a wedding that was not going to happen. She thought about turning around and walking back out the side door. She thought about it with genuine seriousness, the way you think about something that would be easier and is also not possible. "All right," she said. She pushed open the door and walked into the church. Tut. The sound that went through the room when she appeared alone at the back of the aisle was not loud. It was almost polite in its quietness, just a shift, a collective small breath, the particular silence of a room full of people who have just understood something and are deciding how to respond to it. Reverend Dallow stood at the front with an expression that had collapsed into something she could only describe as pained apology. Franklin's mother had turned around in her pew, and the look on her face was not exactly satisfaction, Mabel would tell herself later. It was more like a thing confirmed, a suspicion proven out. Mabel walked halfway up the aisle and stopped. She didn't know why she stopped. Her legs simply didn't take another step. She stood there in the pale blue dress with the wildflowers going slightly limp in her grip, and around her the town of Red Hollow looked back at her with the full weight of its collected pity and its collected judgment, and the two things were almost indistinguishable from each other. Someone, she thought it was Clara Webb, but she couldn't be certain, made a soft sound of sympathy that was worse than silence would have been. A few pews back, she saw Hetty Garland whisper something to the woman beside her, and the woman beside her pressed her lips together and nodded. She was going to have to say something. She was going to have to turn around and walk back down this aisle and leave this building and go back to the boarding house and take off this dress she'd made with her own hands over 3 months. And all of that was going to happen in front of every person in this town who had ever had an opinion about her. She was working on what to say. She was constructing it in her head, something quiet and dignified, something that didn't beg for sympathy or confirm the things they were already thinking, when a voice came from the back of the church. "Miss Cross." She turned. He was sitting in his very last pew on the left side, and she had not noticed him when she'd come in because she'd been looking at Franklin's empty place at the front. She didn't know his name. She'd seen him once or twice in town over the past few weeks. He was not a Red Hollow regular, not someone she could place. He was tall, even sitting down, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of sun-weathered look that came from years of outdoor work rather than a few careless summers. He was not a young man, but he wasn't old either. Somewhere in the middle distance of age where a person has survived enough to stop trying to look like they haven't. He stood up. The church was very quiet. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried without effort, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard across distances. "I came to speak to Reverend Dallow about a property matter. I can see this isn't the right time." He said it plainly, as if he were simply stating a fact about timing, not performing anything, not looking at her with pity or calculation. He was looking at her with a directness that wasn't unkind, and he said quietly enough that it was almost just for her, though the room was silent enough that most of them likely caught it. "You don't have to stand there if you don't want to." Mabel Cross looked at this stranger in the back pew, Then she turned back toward the front of the church, picked up her skirts, and walked back down the aisle. She did not look at Franklin's mother. She did not look at Hetty Garland, or Clara Webb, or Reverend Dallow, or any of the 60 faces arranged to witness what she could only think of as her public unraveling. She walked out the front door into the morning and stood on the church steps and breathed. Behind her, she could hear the room beginning to fill with sound again. The release of 60 people's worth of reaction, all of it expressing itself now that the difficult part was over. She sat down on the top step because her legs made the decision before she did. The wildflowers were crushed in her grip. She opened her hand and looked at them. Small, ordinary things, yellow and white. Nothing special about them except that she'd chosen them herself. And then she set them down on the step beside her and looked out at Main Street, which was going about its normal Tuesday morning business, with complete indifference to the fact that her life had just publicly collapsed. The stranger came out a few minutes later. He didn't say anything immediately. He came down the church steps and stopped on the bottom one, which put him slightly below her eye line, which might have been deliberate or might have been nothing. "Wyatt Granger," he said. She looked at him. "I know you were trying to do something kind in there," she said. "I don't know what, exactly, but I noticed." "Wasn't trying to do anything," he said. "Just thought you looked like you needed an exit." "I wasn't going to cry," she said. It came out slightly defensive, and she didn't entirely mean it that way. "I didn't think you were," he said. She picked at a thread on her sleeve. One of the buttons near her wrist had come slightly loose. She'd noticed it this morning and told herself she'd fix it later, and now later was a very different thing than she'd imagined. "He left on the morning stage," she said. "Apparently." "I heard." "From who?" "The boy who came in the side door. His voice wasn't very quiet." She almost laughed. It startled her, the almost laugh. It came up her throat unexpectedly, and she pressed her lips together, and it went back down. "Mabel Cross," she said. "I know," he said. "You've lived here your whole life." She looked at him. "And you haven't." "No." He looked down the street, then back at her. "I've got a ranch out past the Rayburn Hills, about 12 miles east. Been here, in the area, I mean, a few years. Come into town when I need to." "What was the property matter?" she asked. She didn't actually care about the property matter, but she found that talking about ordinary things kept the inside of her chest from doing what it was threatening to do. "A fence line," he said. "The county surveyor marked the boundary different than I'd been told when I bought the place. Nothing urgent." "My father was a surveyor," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatic, just a small adjustment of attention. "Was he any good?" "At the actual work, yes. At the business of it, not particularly." Wyatt nodded like that was an answer he understood. The door of the church opened and a few people began filing out. Services apparently concluded or abandoned, depending on your perspective. Mabel saw heads turning toward her as they emerged, saw the whisper and glance pattern she'd spent her entire life learning to recognize. She kept her eyes straight ahead. "I don't have anywhere to go right now," she said, which was a strange thing to say out loud to someone she'd just met, but it was also simply true. She had a room at the boarding house, but the thought of walking back to it past the people now coming out of the church felt like something she wasn't prepared to do. Wyatt Granger looked at her for a moment, not with pity, more like he was considering something. "My wagon's at the livery," he said. "I need to head back out to the ranch after I settle the matter with Dallow. You could ride along if you wanted, not as a..." He paused, "just as someone who needs to be somewhere that isn't here." Mabel looked at the people now gathered on the church steps in small clusters, talking. She saw Franklin's mother among them. She saw Clara Webb with her hand on another woman's arm, her expression animated in the way of someone with a good story to tell. "All right," she said. Chug. She didn't go back to the boarding house for her things. There wasn't much she needed immediately. Her sewing kit, a change of clothes, the small tin box where she kept what money she had. But getting those things meant walking back through town, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Wyatt said she could send for anything she needed once they were out at the ranch, and she accepted that because the alternative was worse. He had a good horse and a solid wagon, not fancy, but well kept. When he helped her up onto the wagon seat, offering his hand without comment, without any particular expression about it, she noticed his hands were rough and capable, the hands of someone who used them constantly. The horse was a dun-colored mare named Esther, which Mabel thought was an interesting name for a horse. "Did you name her?" she asked as they pulled out of town. "Previous owner did," he said. "I kept it. Seemed rude to change it. She looks like she deserves a name with more drama. She doesn't seem to mind." The road out of Red Hollow was dry and rutted, lined on either side with prairie grass that had gone stiff and pale in the midsummer heat. Behind them, the town shrank. Mabel watched it go without turning around. She kept her eyes forward, on the flat horizon and the scattered hills beyond it, and let the sound of the wheels on hard earth replace the sound of 60 people and their opinions. The dress was wrong for a wagon, but there was nothing to be done about that. The skirt bunched and pulled at the bench, and after a few miles she stopped trying to manage it and just let it be. There was sweat at the back of her neck. She hadn't eaten anything since the night before. "There's hardtack in the box behind the seat," Wyatt said, without her saying anything. She looked at him. "You've been working your jaw a little," he said, "like someone who hasn't eaten. Is that a skill?" she said. "Or do you just pay close attention to things?" "Mostly the second one," he said. "The first one takes too much effort." She reached back for the hardtack. The ranch was not what she expected, though she hadn't known what she was expecting. It sat in a wide, shallow valley between two ridges, the kind of land that looked spare from a distance and filled in with detail as you got closer. A main house, not large but solid, with a porch that ran the full length of the front. A barn that looked newer than the house, or at least better maintained. 2 outbuildings. A kitchen garden that was actively being beaten back by summer weeds. "It's not finished," he said, as they came down into the valley. He said it matter-of-factly, not apologetically. "What part of it?" "Most of it." He looked at the property with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not satisfaction, not dissatisfaction. Something more like an ongoing negotiation. "I bought it from a family that gave up on it. They'd started more than they could manage. I've been working through what they left." "How long?" 4 years. She looked at the kitchen garden and its losing war with the weeds. "What's planted in there?" "Carrots, some beans, onions, I think, somewhere under that." He pulled the wagon up near the barn and set the brake. "The onions always come back. I don't worry about the onions." She climbed down from the wagon, not waiting for help, just gathering her skirts and stepping down before he could get around to offering, and stood in the yard, looking at the house. "I'm not sure what we're doing," she said. "I want to be clear that I'm aware that I'm not sure what we're doing." "You needed to not be in town," he said. "I needed to get back to the ranch. Those 2 things worked out." "And now?" he considered. "Now you can stay in the spare room as long as you need. I'm not offering anything beyond that. There's no arrangement here. You're not working for me. You're just somewhere that isn't there." He tilted his head back toward the direction they'd come from. "And if I decide to go back tomorrow?" "Then you go back tomorrow." She looked at him for a long moment. He was difficult to read, not because he was hiding something, but because he seemed to have made a deliberate practice of saying exactly what he meant and no more, which made it hard to know what the rest of him was. "Why did you stand up in that church?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. He unhitched Esther and led her toward the water trough, and Mabel walked beside him without planning to. "You looked like someone who needed permission to leave," he finally said. "I didn't need permission," she said. "No," he agreed, "but sometimes it's easier if someone says it out loud." She didn't have a response to that. She watched the horse drink and thought about Franklin's mother's face, and thought about Hetty Garland's whisper, and thought about the dress she was still wearing, which was starting to feel like an accusation. "Is there somewhere I can change?" she asked. "Bah?" The spare room was small and plainly furnished. A bed with a serviceable quilt, a chest of drawers with a cracked mirror above it, a window that looked out at the east ridge. The bed was made, which surprised her. She'd half expected the casual disorder of a man living alone, but the room was clean in the way of a place that doesn't get used but gets maintained anyway. He'd left a folded shirt and a pair of work trousers outside the door. His own, she assumed, turned up at the cuffs. Without explanation, just left them there and gone back outside. She put them on. They were large on her, but not absurdly so, and there was something in wearing plain work clothes instead of the pale blue dress that allowed her to breathe in a way she hadn't been doing properly since morning. She folded the dress carefully. She was not going to throw it away or tear it apart or do anything dramatic with it. She'd spent 3 months on those seams. She put it in the bottom of the chest of drawers and closed the drawer and stood in the center of the room. She did not cry. She had been not crying for approximately 4 hours by this point, and she was becoming something of an expert at it. What she felt was not grief exactly, or at least not grief for Franklin Holt, who she was already understanding she had not known very well. What she felt was more like the particular humiliation of having been publicly wrong about something, of having wanted a thing and reaching for it in front of everyone and having it turn out to be air. She'd wanted to matter to someone. That was the most honest version of it, stripped of everything else. She'd wanted one person to see her, not the body, not the reputation, not the sum of Red Hollow's opinions about her, and decide she was worth staying for. Franklin had seemed like that person and had turned out not to be, and that was its own particular loneliness. But it was the 60 people in that church that she kept coming back to. Their faces, the quality of their attention. She sat on the edge of the bed. From outside came ordinary ranch sounds, the horse, some kind of bird, the distant creak of something that needed oil, Wyatt Granger moving around his property, doing the work that needed doing, apparently unbothered by the fact that he had a strange woman in his spare room. She should go out and be useful, she thought. She was not someone who sat still while there was work to be done. She'd never been that person. But she stayed on the edge of the bed a few minutes longer, because she had burned biscuits this morning and had walked into a church in front of 60 people and had ridden 12 miles into unfamiliar territory in a wedding dress, and she thought she was entitled to 3 more minutes of just sitting. Outside, the afternoon was pushing toward evening. The light had gone from flat white to something longer and lower and more golden, which made the hills look closer than they were. Mabel had found an apron on a hook near the kitchen door and tied it on without asking, and she was working through the kitchen garden with the methodical patience of someone who knew what they were doing. She'd identified the onions, still alive, though everything around them had been trying to reclaim the territory, and she was pulling weeds with a kind of systematic aggression that she found deeply satisfying. Wyatt appeared around the side of the barn and stopped when he saw her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. He watched her work for a moment. "You know what you're doing." "I had a kitchen garden for 3 years on my father's property before he died," she said. "Then I moved to the boarding house and didn't have one, and I've missed it more than most things." She pulled out a particularly obstinate root and held it up briefly before throwing it aside. "Do you have any actual tools? I've been doing this by hand." "There's a hoe in the barn, second stall on the left." She went and got it. By the time the light started going seriously orange and the temperature began to drop from brutal to merely uncomfortable, she had cleared roughly a third of the garden. It wasn't beautiful. The remaining weeds were dense, and she'd made deliberate choices about where to start and where to leave for tomorrow. But the section she'd cleared was clean down to the soil, and the vegetable plants visible in it looked distinctly healthier for the attention, the way plants do when you stop making them compete for every bit of light. She stood up and stretched her back and looked at what she'd done and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled all day. Wyatt came out onto the porch. "I've got something on the stove," he said. "Nothing much." "I can help with that too," she said. "I didn't mean it as a request." "I know." She set the hoe against the fence and came toward the porch. "I'm offering anyway." He held the door open. She went in. The kitchen was functional in the way of a person who cooks for utility rather than enjoyment. Clean surfaces, practical organization, nothing decorative. There was a pot of something on the stove that smelled like beans and salt pork, which was not exciting but was actual food. She found a pan and made cornbread from what was in the pantry, moving around the unfamiliar kitchen with the careful attention of someone mapping a new space while working in it. They ate at the kitchen table without much conversation. The cornbread was decent. The beans were filling. Outside, the evening came in completely, and the ranch got dark except for the lamp on the table and whatever the night sky was doing, which was apparently considerable. When Mabel went to the window to look out, the stars were the kind of extravagance that you only get 12 miles from the nearest town. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes," he said. "I've never lived anywhere quiet." She paused. "I mean, I've never lived in a place where the quiet was the default and the noise was the exception. It's always been the other way. He was quiet himself for a moment. Then, it takes some getting used to. Did it take you long? He considered. About a year before I stopped waiting for something to break it. She looked at the dark window and the reflected lamp in it, and her own pale reflection overlaid on the night. What did you do before this? She asked. Cattle work, mostly. Other things. He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. Do you ever go to town? She asked. Beyond property matters. When I need to. Not for the company. No, he said. Not defensively, just factually. Not for the company. She nodded. She could understand that in a way she hadn't been able to before today. The company of Red Hollow had never done her any particular favors, but she'd kept going back to it because she was afraid of being invisible even to herself. I'll do dishes, she said, standing. You don't... I know, she said again. I want to. He let her. Later, alone in the small room with the cracked mirror, she sat on the edge of the bed again and took the pins out of her hair one by one and set them on the chest of drawers. Her hair fell down around her shoulders, dark and thick, and curling at the ends in the way it always did in heat, and she looked at herself in the mirror. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been through a specific kind of day, but she also noticed, with some surprise, that she didn't look as broken as she'd expected. Her face was her face. Her eyes were still her eyes. She'd walked into a church alone, and she'd walked out. She'd ridden 12 miles and worked a kitchen garden and made cornbread in an unfamiliar kitchen. She had not cried in front of 60 people or in a stranger's wagon or in a sparse spare bedroom. She had not performed gratitude she didn't feel or collapsed under the weight of the morning's humiliation in any way that felt worse than what had actually happened. That was not nothing. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror for a long moment. Then she blew out the lamp and lay down on top of the quilt, because it was still warm enough that she didn't need it yet. Outside, the night was enormous and silent. From somewhere far off came the sound of coyotes. Not close, not threatening, just present. A fact of the landscape. She lay in the dark and thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow was not yet a thing she knew. It was just a direction. But tomorrow, she thought, she would finish the kitchen garden and find out what else needed doing, and she would eat something before noon so she didn't spend all morning working on an empty stomach, and she would figure out one step at a time. What a life looked like when it turned out not to be the life she'd planned. She'd been wrong about Franklin Holt, and that was its own kind of grief, and she would probably feel it more fully in some future moment when she had the room for it. But what she'd been wrong about wasn't wanting. She'd wanted the right things. She just wanted them from the wrong person. The coyotes went quiet. The stars continued doing their extravagant thing outside the window. Mabel Cross closed her eyes. She was wrong about one thing. She told herself, lying in the dark that first night, that she would finish the kitchen garden in the morning. What she hadn't accounted for was the state of the rest of the ranch, which revealed itself in the early light as significantly more complicated than a neglected vegetable patch. The previous owners had left behind not just unfinished work, but work done badly. Fence posts set at wrong angles, a section of the barn roof patched with boards that were already warping, a water channel from the creek that had been dug too shallow and was silting over. Mabel didn't know all the specifics yet, but she could see enough from the porch with her morning coffee to understand that Wyatt Granger had been fighting a sustained battle against someone else's poor decisions for 4 years. She found him at first light, already out by the east fence, crouched down examining one of the posts. She brought him coffee without asking whether he wanted it, and he took it without making a production of the gesture. "How bad is that section?" she asked. He squinted along the fence line. "About 40 feet of it needs to come out and go back in right." He drank the coffee. "The angle's wrong, and the posts are rotting at the base. The cat'll figure that out eventually." "You have cattle out here now?" 23 head. They're pastured on the north side, farther from this fence." He stood up. "For now." She looked at the post. Even she could see the lean of it. Not dramatic, but persistent, the kind of failure that had been happening slowly for a while. "What do you need to fix it?" He looked at her sideways. "I'm asking a practical question," she said. "I'm not offering to dig fence posts in a skirt, but I can hold things, hand tools, do the parts that don't require someone twice my size. It's hard work." "I pulled weeds for 3 hours yesterday in a wedding dress," she said. "I'm aware it's hard work." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the edge of one. The suggestion that a smile was somewhere in the general vicinity. "There's extra gloves in the barn," he said. The next 2 weeks had a rhythm that surprised her by existing at all. She'd expected the days to feel indefinite, shapeless. She was a woman with no plan staying in a stranger's spare room, which was not a situation that naturally produced structure. But the ranch had its own demands, and demands created shape. She was up before the sun most mornings, because Wyatt was up before the sun, and the sounds of him moving around the kitchen woke her, and she had never been good at sleeping once she was awake. They ate breakfast together. Simple things. Eggs when the two hens were cooperating, oatmeal when they weren't. He made coffee strong enough to serve as structural material, which she did not complain about because she had come to depend on it. The fence work took 4 days. She had not been lying about her usefulness. She couldn't drive posts, but she could hold the brace while he swung the mallet, and she could hand him wire and cut it when he needed it cut. And she turned out to be better than either of them expected at the fine work of stretching and securing the wire at the joins, her fingers small and precise in ways his weren't. He acknowledged this without ceremony, just handed her the task and let her do it. On the 3rd day of fence work, she smashed her thumb with the mallet. It was her own fault. She'd been watching a hawk circle out over the north pasture instead of watching what her hands were doing, and when she brought the mallet down for a test strike on a post she was checking, she caught the side of her thumb on the wood. The pain was immediate and spectacular. "Language," Wyatt said from directly behind her. She realized she'd said something out loud. "Sorry, don't apologize." He came around and looked at her thumb, which was already purpling at the base of the nail. "Hold it up." "I know what to do with a smashed thumb," she said. "Then do it." She held her hand up and breathed through the pain, which was the only real option with this particular kind of injury. Wyatt went to the water jug they'd brought out and poured cold water over a rag and handed it to her, and she wrapped it around her thumb without comment. "It's not broken," she said after a minute of assessment. "Probably not," he agreed. He picked up where she'd left off on the fence without remarking on her error, and she went back to work after another minute, and neither of them brought it up again. That evening, her thumb had swollen enough that she had trouble with some of the smaller buttons on the shirt she'd been wearing, and she sat at the kitchen table after supper fighting with the cuff button with what she recognized as disproportionate frustration. "Here," Wyatt said. She looked up. He was standing beside the table with his hand out, waiting. Not demanding, just offering. She put her wrist out and he undid the button in one motion without any particular fuss about it, and then went back to whatever he'd been doing at the counter. She sat there a moment with the unbuttoned cuff hanging open. "Thank you," she said. "It's a button," he said. She'd sent a note to Dottie Marsh at the end of the first week, asking her to collect her things from the boarding house room. She'd kept the note practical and brief. What she needed, where it was, how to get a wagon to bring it. She did not explain herself because she wasn't certain she could explain herself, and she thought that a short, honest note was better than a long, uncertain one. Dottie arrived on a Saturday with a wagon and 2 of the things Mabel had asked for, and approximately 40% of the things she hadn't, including a neighbor woman named Ruth Polly, who apparently felt that moral support was required and had appointed herself to provide it. Ruth Polly was the wife of the man who ran Red Hollow's feed store. She was a practical woman in most respects, but she had a tendency to speak with tremendous confidence about situations she understood imperfectly, and she had clearly been running the narrative of Mabel's recent circumstances through her own considerable interpretive machinery. "You're looking well," Ruth said, standing in the yard and looking at Mabel with an expression that suggested she'd expected to find her significantly worse. "Better than I expected, honestly, though you've got dirt on your face." "I was in the garden," Mabel said. "Of course you were." Ruth looked at the ranch with the assessing eye of a woman who owned property and had opinions about other people's. "It's quite remote out here." "That's generally what 12 miles from town means." Ruth's gaze moved to the house, then the barn, then back to Mabel. "And Mr. Granger, he's treating you well?" "He's treating me like a person, yes." "That's not quite what I asked." Mabel looked at her steadily. "I know what you asked." She reached into the wagon for one of her boxes. "I'm here because the ranch needed work, and I needed somewhere to be, and those two things lined up sensibly. That's the whole story. The whole town is... I know what the whole town is, Mabel said. I've been in Red Hollow my whole life. I know exactly what the whole town is. Ruth was quiet for a moment, and to her credit, she heard the thing underneath that sentence. Her voice shifted when she spoke again. Less report, more actual concern. Are you all right? Mabel set the box down and looked at her. Ruth Pauley was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who processed the world through the opinions of her community, and that made her sometimes thoughtless, but it didn't make her unkind. I'm better than I was, Mabel said honestly. That's the most accurate answer I have. Ruth nodded. Then, in a slightly different register, Franklin Holt hasn't come back, you know. No one knows where he went. He was always going to go somewhere, Mabel said, and realized as she said it that this was true and that some part of her had probably known it. Men like Franklin find a direction and call it a decision. It doesn't matter much where he went. Dottie, who had been carefully unloading the wagon without making eye contact with anyone, looked up at that. That's a hard thing to say about someone you almost married. It's not hard, Mabel said. It's just accurate. After they left, Mabel brought her boxes into the house and unpacked them in the spare room. Her sewing kit, a proper one, not the small portable version she carried for repairs, took up most of the chest top. Needles, thread in 12 colors, shears good enough to cut without dragging, a set of pins she'd saved up for over 2 years. She arranged it with the care of someone handling tools that matter. At the bottom of the second box, wrapped in brown paper, was the dress. Dottie had packed it. Mabel had not asked her to. She stood looking at it for a moment, the brown paper wrapping, the shape of the folded fabric underneath it, and then she put it in the bottom drawer of the chest and went back outside. She found Wyatt at the barn, working on the hinge of the main door, which had been pulling wrong all week. I need to go into town for supplies, she said. Not today, but in the next week or so. I have a project I want to start. He looked up. What kind of project? Sewing, she said. There's a woman out past the Kimberly claim, Mrs. Adler, who I heard needs alterations done. Her daughter's getting married, and the dress they ordered came in wrong. Too large in the bodice, too long in the hem. She paused. I know about dresses. He looked at her in that way he had, straight and quiet, not evaluating, just listening. I'm not asking for permission, she clarified. I'm telling you I'll need to be away from the ranch for a day to go in and get materials. All right, he said, and I'll need to borrow the wagon. All right, he said again. She waited for something more. There wasn't anything more. He went back to the hinge. She went back to the garden. The town was exactly as she'd left it, which was simultaneously obvious and strange. Red Hollow did not have the grace to look different. The same dust on Main Street, the same angle of late summer light on the false front buildings, the same small cluster of men outside the saloon who were managing their time with beer in a way they called conversation. Mabel drove Esther down the main street without rushing and without looking anywhere other than where she was going. She was wearing a clean blouse and her own skirt. Her things had arrived with the wagon, and her hair was pinned in the particular way she'd always worn it. She looked, she thought, like herself, not like someone hiding. She could feel attention from the boardwalk. Not all of it unfriendly. Some of it was just curiosity, which was almost worse because it was harder to be angry at. But she kept her pace and stopped the wagon outside the dry goods store that wasn't Franklin Holt's anymore. Apparently, there was a new man behind the counter, wide and cheerful, who told her Franklin's cousin had taken over the property and the business both. Recently? She asked. 3 weeks back, cousin came down from up north. The man, he introduced himself as Amos Steer, had a straightforward face and seemed uninterested in the history attached to Mabel's presence in the store. You're looking for fabric? Cotton and muslin, she said, and thread. Blues and greens mostly, some white. I've got a specific list. She handed him the list, and he worked through it without drama, and she paid for it with the money she'd kept in the tin box, and felt a small, specific satisfaction at the transaction. Something bought and paid for with her own resources for her own purposes. She was loading the packages into the wagon when Hetty Garland appeared. Hetty was not a bad person, Mabel had always told herself, even when she wanted to think otherwise. She was a woman who kept herself significant in a small town by being first with information, and that was its own kind of limitation. She came down the boardwalk with the particular walk of someone who has manufactured a coincidence. "Mabel," she said, "you're looking, well." "Hetty," Mabel said, and kept loading. "We've been wondering about you." Hetty folded her hands in front of her in the gesture that meant she was about to say something she'd rehearsed. "It's just, people don't quite know what to think about the situation out there." "There's no situation," Mabel said. "I'm doing work at the Granger Ranch. It's a working arrangement." "But you're living out there." "In the spare room," Mabel said. "Yes." "People talk," Hetty said. The words came out almost apologetically, which was a particular skill she had, the art of delivering gossip while appearing to regret its existence. Mabel set the last package in the wagon bed and turned to face her directly. "Hetty," she said, "let me be clear about something. People have been talking about me my entire life in this town. They've talked about my weight, my mother dying, my father's bad luck, my sewing business being beneath them to use despite the fact that most of their dresses have passed through my hands at some point. They talked when I said yes to Franklin Holt, and they talked when he left, and they'll talk about whatever I do next regardless of what it is. I've understood this for a long time. What I've stopped doing is adjusting my choices to manage it." Hetty opened her mouth, closed it. "I hope your family's well," Mabel said, and climbed up onto the wagon seat and drove away. Her hands were shaking slightly on the reins. She noticed this and acknowledged it, not with shame, because she'd said exactly what she meant to say, but with recognition. That had cost something. Even when you were right, confrontation cost something. That was just true. She didn't look back at Main Street as she left it. Mrs. Adler's farm was 3 miles east of town, a tidy property with a hen house that was better organized than most people's living rooms. The woman herself was in her 50s, gray-haired and efficient, with the brisk manner of someone who had survived enough to stop wasting time on hesitation. She looked at the dress immediately, spreading it on the kitchen table with critical eyes. "Completely wrong in the bodice," she confirmed. "And the hem will drag. Nora will trip going up to the—" She paused, rerouting around a word. "Going to the front of the ceremony." Mabel looked at the dress. It was a nicer fabric than her own had been. Silk, actually, cream-colored, with small pearl buttons that were actually pearl. The bodice seams were not well executed. Someone had rushed them. "When's the wedding?" she asked. 6 weeks? That's enough time." She picked up a seam near the shoulder and examined it. "The stitching here will need to come out entirely. The proportions are off at the origin point. Whoever cut this didn't account for the armhole correctly. If I just take in the sides, it'll pull wrong." Mrs. Adler watched her with the expression of someone who has found a person who actually knows what they're doing. "Can you fix it?" "Yes," Mabel said without hesitation. "I'll need to take measurements, and Nora will need to come out to the ranch at least once for a fitting, possibly twice." "I can manage that." Mrs. Adler named a price. Mabel had been preparing to negotiate, but the number was fair, more than fair, and she accepted it without false modesty. She rode back towards the ranch with the dress carefully wrapped in the back of the wagon and a specific, quiet pleasure running underneath everything else. She hadn't been certain what she'd find when she sat down with that dress. She'd wondered these past weeks whether she could still trust her own hands to do what she'd trained them to do, whether the confidence she'd built in her sewing work over years was something Franklin's departure had somehow damaged along with everything else. It hadn't. The knowledge was still there, settled in her hands and her eyes, patient and unimpressed by the recent disasters. She could do this. That seemed, in the particular way of that afternoon, like more than it sounds. Back at the ranch, she set up the work area at the kitchen table. It was the flattest, best-lit surface available, and started with the unpicking. Wyatt came in around dusk and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the spread of silk and thread and tools across his table. "That's a wedding dress," he said. "Alterations work," she said. "Mrs. Adler's daughter." She didn't look up from the seam she was opening. "I'll clear everything up before supper." "You don't need to clear it for supper," he said. "We can eat at the counter." She looked up then. He was already moving toward the stove to check whatever she'd put on earlier. "It'll be 3 weeks of work at least," she said, "possibly spread over most of the table." Then we'll eat at the counter for 3 weeks, he said. She looked at the side of his face, the uncommunicative profile, the matter-of-fact set of his jaw. You're a strange man, she said. So I've been told, he said. She went back to the unpicking. The lamp was on the table between them, him at the stove, her at the table, and outside the window the dark had come in completely and the stars were doing their thing again. The sound of the seam opening under her unpicking tool was small and clean and regular, like a particular kind of quiet. She'd been thinking about something since the conversation with Hetty Garland on Main Street. She'd been thinking about what she'd said, that she'd stopped adjusting her choices to manage other people's talk. She'd said it as a statement of fact, and it was true as of that afternoon, but she was aware that it was a new truth, not an old one. She'd been adjusting her choices to manage other people's opinions her whole life. She'd agreed to alterations jobs she wasn't paid enough for because she didn't want to seem difficult. She'd worn quieter clothes than she wanted because she didn't need more attention on her appearance. She'd said yes to Franklin Holt partly because she was 30 years past when people expected her to be wanted, and she'd been afraid that if she hesitated, the opportunity would close. That wasn't self-pity, she thought. It was just honest accounting. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask, Wyatt said. Why don't you come to town more? Is it just that you don't like people, or is there something specific? He was quiet for a moment, stirring whatever was in the pot. Bit of both, he said. I did things for a while that required being around a lot of people. I decided I was done with that kind of work, and I bought this ranch. And the ranch has generally confirmed that I made the right call. What kind of work? Cattle drives, mostly. Some other things. He paused. Disputes. Disputes, she repeated. People hiring out someone to settle things they couldn't settle themselves. He said it with the flat economy of a man summarizing a period of his life he has fully accounted for. It paid, but the people involved they weren't always on the right side of things. You quit. I quit, he said. Bought this place. The previous owners had left it in a state, but it was 12 miles from town, and I could see what it could be. She considered this. And now you're 12 miles from town with a woman in your spare room doing alterations. Yes, he said. Does that bother you? He turned from the stove and looked at her directly. If it bothered me, he said, you'd have ridden back to town with Ruth Pauley. That was probably the longest definitive sentence she'd heard him construct, and she found it unexpectedly reassuring in the way of things that are said simply and mean exactly what they say. All right, she said. Supper's ready, he said. Gunt. The week settled into the work. The dress for Nora Adler came together slowly and correctly. Mabel found 3 separate errors in the original construction, each one cascading from the one before it, and fixing them required patience and the willingness to fully undo work before redoing it. Nora came out to the ranch for a fitting in the second week, a young woman of about 19 who was calm and good-humored about the amount of pinning involved. It feels different already, Nora said, standing in the middle of the kitchen while Mabel worked around her. Lighter, somehow, the way it sits on my shoulders. The original cut was pulling forward, Mabel said through the pins in her mouth. She removed them one by one as she placed them. When fabric pulls like that, it creates tension across the back, and you feel it as weight. Once the shoulder seam is set right, it'll distribute evenly. Where did you learn to sew like this? Nora asked. Not with condescension, with genuine curiosity. My mother taught me the basics. After she died, I kept going on my own. Mabel sat back on her heels and looked at the bodice assessment. I got good at it because I needed clothes that fit, and I couldn't afford to have them made, and I was tired of wearing things that didn't. Nora looked down at her. Is that hard? When you can make anything for other people, but you started because you had to make things for yourself? It was a more perceptive question than Mabel had expected. She thought about it honestly. It was for a while, she said. But skill doesn't care about the circumstances that made it. It's just yours. She had a second piece of work by the end of that week. Amos Steer at the dry goods mentioned her name to his wife, who mentioned it to the wife of a man who ran a small freighting business and who needed a coat repaired urgently. Then that woman mentioned her to someone else. She was not overwhelmed with commissions. But she had work, and the work was good, and word of it was moving through the settlements around Red Hollow, the way information moves in small communities, slowly but inevitably, following the lines of daily need. She bought a small notebook from Amos on her next supply run and began keeping track of commissions and materials and money owed and money paid. The numbers were modest, but they were real, and they were hers. Wyatt noticed the notebook on the counter one evening and picked it up, not to read it. He set it back down immediately, but with the expression of someone who had registered something. "You're building something," he said. "Trying to," she said. "What do you need that you don't have?" She thought about it. Better light in the evenings, a second lamp, maybe, and eventually a proper workspace, a table that's specifically for the work. "I'm being careful with the kitchen table, but it's not ideal for everything." He nodded, as if she'd given him information to file away. She didn't think anything more about it. 3 days later, she came in from the kitchen garden to find a second lamp on the kitchen table and a note beside it in Wyatt's handwriting, which was large and careful and slightly surprising in its neatness. For the light. Found it at Kimberly's auction last month, was in the barn. She held the note for a moment. She thought about going to find him and saying thank you properly, and then she thought about how he'd said it's a button when he undid her cuff, and she understood that elaborate gratitude would embarrass him. She put the lamp on the side of the table, and that evening her stitching was better because the light reached the work properly. She didn't say thank you, but the next morning she made biscuits, real ones, not burned, and left half of them on the counter for him without comment. Bye. The summer was beginning, in the slow way of Plains country, to suggest that it would not last forever. The evenings were fractionally shorter. The mornings carried just a hint of something cooler in the air that hadn't been there a month ago. Mabel had been at the ranch for nearly 5 weeks, a fact that occasionally presented itself to her mind with a mild sense of unreality. She had a rhythm here. She had work. She had a place where the default was quiet rather than the noise of other people's opinions. It was not what she'd imagined, and it was also not bad. And she was learning to hold those two things in the same space without needing to resolve them into something tidier. One afternoon near the end of August, she was at the fence line on the east side. Not fixing anything this time, just walking the line the way Wyatt had shown her because it was easier to catch problems early. And she heard him before she saw him, his voice carrying across the flat ground from where he was working with the horses in the paddock. He was talking to Esther. She couldn't make out the words from this distance, but the tone was easy and low, the voice of a man who was comfortable being overheard by a horse and no one else. Mabel watched him for a moment from where she stood at the fence, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved around the mare without rushed motions, his whole body communicating a kind of unhurried patience that she'd watched him bring to every aspect of the ranch work and that she'd slowly begun to understand was not distance, but a particular quality of attention. He looked up and saw her watching. She didn't look away because that would have made it into something. She raised her hand in a small acknowledgement, and he raised his in return, and she went back to walking the fence line. She was thinking about what Ruth Pauley would say, what Hetty Garland would say, what the women of the quilting circle that had never invited her in would say about the specific picture she'd just made. Mabel Cross, standing at a fence on a stranger's ranch, watching him work with his horse and raising her hand in greeting. She found that she was less troubled by this picture than she would have been 6 weeks ago. Not untroubled. She was not going to pretend that the judgments of her community had become entirely irrelevant to her. That would have been a lie, and she'd been making a practice lately of not lying to herself about things. But the judgments had become something she could look at from a distance rather than something she was inside of, and that was a real difference. The fence line was sound for another 100 yards. She noted it in her head. She'd told Wyatt she'd check it, and she was checking it, and then she turned and walked back toward the house in the late afternoon light, which was doing the same orange and gold thing it always did out here, which she had also been slowly, without planning to, coming to rely on. Nora Adler's wedding dress was finished on a Thursday, 3 days ahead of when Mabel had promised it. She'd been working late the last 2 evenings, using the second lamp to extend the usable light into the hours after supper, and the final result was, she let herself think this privately, without saying it out loud, the best work she'd done in years. Not because the repairs were flashy, they weren't. The whole point of good alteration work was that you couldn't see it when it was done, that the garment looked as though it had been made correctly the first time. But she knew what she'd fixed, and she knew how she'd fixed it, and when she held the finished dress up in the morning light coming through the kitchen window, the bodice sat exactly right, the hem fell exactly right, and the silk moved the way silk was supposed to move, without argument. She wrapped it carefully and set it by the door. Wyatt came in for breakfast and saw it there. "Done?" "Done," she said. "Early," he said. "Yes." She poured coffee. "I'll take it out to Mrs. Adler this morning if you don't need the wagon." "It's yours to use," he said. He sat down and looked at the package for a moment. How'd it come out? She considered the question with the honesty she'd been practicing. "Well," she said, "it came out well." He nodded, as if that settled something. "She'll pay the second half on delivery," Mabel said, "which means I'll have enough to buy the material for the Beaumont order." She'd taken on a second commission 2 weeks back, a family 3 settlements east who needed 2 work shirts and a winter coat cut down for a younger son who'd inherited it from an older one. Not elegant work, but solid and steady, and the kind of thing she could do quickly. After that, "I want to think about whether there's a way to get word out to more of the settlements." Wyatt looked at her over his cup. "What kind of word?" "That I do alterations and commissions, that I'm reliable and I know what I'm doing." She sat down across from him. "There's a dry goods in Pell's Crossing that sells fabric and takes in mending sometimes. I thought I might approach them about working through them. They take a percentage. I get a steadier flow of work." "That's sensible," he said. "I don't know if they'll agree." "They might not," he said. "Worth asking." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it's complicated? That it might not work?" "It might not work," he said. "That's different from it not being worth trying." She drank her coffee and thought about that, and about the fact that Wyatt Granger had not once, in the 7 weeks she'd known him, told her that something was harder than she thought, or that she should scale back what she was reaching for. He simply gave her his honest assessment of the situation and then let her make her own decision, which was, she was increasingly aware, a rarer quality than it should have been. Mrs. Adler received the dress with the focused attention of a woman who inspects things properly before approving them, which Mabel respected. She checked the bodice, the hem, the button placement, the way the seams lay when the dress was held up to the light. Then she looked at Mabel. "Nora's going to weep when she sees it," she said. "I hope in a good way," Mabel said. "In a very good way." Mrs. Adler went to the tin box on her kitchen shelf and counted out the second payment. "I'm going to tell people," she said. "You should know that. I don't say things like that if I don't mean to follow through." "I appreciate it," Mabel said. "There's a woman in Pell's Crossing, Vera Stanhope. She runs the dry goods there with her husband, who I've known for 15 years. I'll write her before the week is out." Mabel looked at her. "I was going to approach them myself." "You still can," Mrs. Adler said. "But it's easier if someone gets there first." She handed over the money without ceremony. "That's just how things move out here. You know that." She did know that. She'd lived her whole life in a community where information traveled through relationships before it traveled through any official channel, and where a word from the right person could open a door that direct approach might not. She'd just spent so many years being on the wrong side of that particular network, her name moving through it as a subject rather than a recommendation, that she'd forgotten it could work the other way. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. On the drive back to the ranch, with the second payment in her pocket and the empty afternoon stretching out around her, she found herself doing the arithmetic she'd been doing more often lately. What she'd earned, what she'd spent, what it would take to accumulate enough to eventually have a permanent workspace of her own. Not a grand ambition, a room, properly lit, with a good table and a dress form and enough storage for materials. Something that was hers. The number was still a long way off, but it was a number, which was further than a dream. She came back to the ranch to find a man she didn't know standing in the yard. He was red hollow, familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place, the type rather than the specific person, the broad-shouldered, self-certain posture of a man who owned land and knew it, and thought that meant something about his standing. He was standing near the barn talking to Wyatt in the way of a conversation that had already gone wrong, though both men were maintaining the surface forms of civility. She drove up and set the brake and climbed down, and the man turned to look at her with an expression that was assessing without being interested. "Miss Cross," he said. She didn't know him. You have me at a disadvantage, she said. Harlan Pruitt. He said it with the weight of a name he expected to land. I've got the Pruitt grazing land south of here, about 4,000 acres. Mr. Pruitt, she said. She looked at Wyatt, who had the particular stillness of a man exercising a choice to stay still. I was just saying to Mr. Granger, Pruitt said, that this arrangement of yours is causing talk, considerable talk, in town. Mabel set her empty wagon box on the tailgate and turned to face him. What arrangement is that? A single woman living at a man's ranch. You understand how that reads. I understand how some people choose to read it, she said. That's a slightly different thing. Pruitt's expression tightened. He was not used to this particular response. I'm offering you some friendly advice, Miss Cross, for your own protection. A woman in your position? What position is that? He paused. He had a speech prepared, and she kept interrupting the architecture of it. A woman without family, he said, who's had a public difficulty, and who is now living in an ambiguous situation. People draw conclusions. People have been drawing conclusions about me since I was a child, Mabel said. What is it you actually want, Mr. Pruitt? The question was direct enough that it seemed to surprise him. He looked at Wyatt briefly, then back at her. I have a business interest in this ranch, he said. A potential interest. Mr. Granger knows I've made an offer on this property. An ongoing offer. Having complications attached to the place makes that more difficult. There it was. Mabel looked at him with the specific clarity of a person who has just understood the actual shape of a conversation they thought was about something else. You want to buy this ranch, she said. I've offered a fair price. And you've come out here to tell me that my presence is a reputational liability? To pressure Mr. Granger by way of me? Pruitt's jaw tightened. I'm stating a fact about how the community perceives the situation. No, Mabel said. You're using the community's opinion as leverage. Those are different things. She looked at him steadily. I've lived in Red Hollow my whole life, Mr. Pruitt. I know the difference. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a conversation has arrived somewhere that wasn't expected. Wyatt spoke then, for the first time since she'd arrived. His voice was the same as it always was. Level, without heat. I've told you my answer on the property, he said. It hasn't changed. Pruitt looked between them. The assessment on his face had shifted into something cooler, less performatively friendly. I'll be in touch, he said, which was a thing people said when they meant the conversation wasn't over on their end, even if it was on yours. He walked to his horse, mounted without hurry, and rode south. Mabel and Wyatt stood in the yard and watched him go. How long has he been trying to buy this place? She asked. Since about 8 months after I moved in, Wyatt said. He wants the water rights. There's a creek that comes through the east corner of my property. It's the only reliable source for about 2 miles in any direction. He's been building up his cattle operation, and he needs the water. And you've been saying no. I need the water too, he said simply. She looked at the direction Pruitt had ridden. He's going to keep coming. Yes, Wyatt said. He's going to use me as a reason, she said. The arrangement, the talk. He was looking for a reason before you got here, Wyatt said. He'll look for one after. The reason changes. The wanting doesn't. She thought about that. I don't want to be a liability to you. He looked at her with an expression that was as close to direct impatience as she'd seen from him. You're not, he said. You don't know. You fixed 40 feet of fence, he said. You cleared the kitchen garden. You've been walking the east line twice a week for a month. The ranch runs better than it did in September. He looked away toward the barn. You're not a liability. She was quiet for a moment. You're terrible at receiving concern, she said. I know, he said, and went back to the barn. But the conversation with Pruitt sat with her for the rest of that week in the particular way of unfinished things. It wasn't fear exactly. She'd been subject to social pressure from people with more standing than her for so long that the form of it was familiar, almost boring in its predictability. But there was something in the specific mechanism of it that made her think. Pruitt had used the community's opinion of her as a tool. He'd walked onto this property and picked up the weight of Red Hollow's judgment and tried to swing it at Wyatt, using Mabel herself as the instrument. And the reason he could do that, the reason it had any force at all, was because she had no standing, no recognized position. She was a woman staying on a man's ranch with no formal arrangement, no family, no community standing to speak of, and so she was a question mark. And question marks in small frontier communities resolved into the worst possible interpretation as a default. She didn't tell Wyatt what she'd been thinking, but on Saturday, when she drove into Red Hollow for supplies, she stopped at the post office and picked up the small crate of materials she'd ordered through Amos Steer, and then she went and stood in front of the empty building 2 doors down from the feed store and looked at it for a long time. It had been a dressmaker's shop once. The woman who'd run it had moved away after her husband died. No reason to stay, apparently, and several reasons not to. The windows were dusty and the sign was gone, but the bones of the space were there, a front room, a back workroom, good windows on the south side. She didn't have enough money to rent it, not yet, but the knowing of where it was, the possibility of it, felt like something to put in her pocket and carry. She stopped at Amos Steer's on the way back to pick up thread. "Do you know who owns that building?" she asked, indicating with a tilt of her head. "The empty one down from the feed store." Amos thought about it. Kimberly family, I believe. The father bought a few properties on this street before he died. One of his sons is managing the estate. "Which son?" "Gerald Kimberly." He paused. "He's not difficult to deal with, business-minded, doesn't hold on to things for sentiment." "Good to know," she said, and paid for her thread and went back to the wagon. She told Wyatt about it that evening. Not all of it, not the part about Pruitt still sitting at the back of her mind, not the whole complicated architecture of what she'd been thinking, just the practical part. "There's an empty building in town that used to be a dressmaker's," she said. "I want to eventually rent it." He looked up from the harness he was mending. "Eventually." "I don't have enough yet," she said, "but I'm getting closer." Mrs. Adler's referral to Vera Stanhope in Pell's Crossing came through. "I heard from her yesterday. She wants to meet." She sat down at the table across from him. "If that goes well, I'll have a steady enough flow to think about a real workspace." "In town," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. This isn't me saying I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm saying I'm building toward something." He set the harness down and looked at her with the directness she'd come to expect. "I know," he said. "I figured that out about 2 weeks after you got here." She looked back at him. "Is that all right?" "Why wouldn't it be?" "Because I'm using your ranch as a station," she said. "A place to land while I build something of my own." "You're not just using it," he said. "The ranch is in better shape than it was." He picked the harness back up. "And you make better biscuits than I do." She almost laughed. The almost laugh became an actual one, which surprised her the way it always did. Her own laughter catching her off guard, like something that had been waiting for the right moment. "I'm going to meet with Vera Stanhope next week," she said, pulling herself back. "Good," he said. She opened her notebook. "I want to think through what I'm going to say. The pricing, the arrangement, what I'll offer her, and what I'll want in return." "Tell me," he said, "and I'll tell you if anything sounds wrong." She looked at him. "You know about business arrangements?" "I know about negotiations," he said. "Different contexts, same principles." So she told him. She laid out what she was thinking. The percentage she'd offer Stanhope, what she'd retain, how she'd handle disputes over materials, what the commission structure would look like for larger pieces versus alterations. She talked through it the way she'd been turning it over in her head, and Wyatt listened with the quality of attention she'd come to trust, which was complete without being performative. When she finished, he said, "Your percentage to her is too high. She's providing the customer base. She's providing a referral channel. That's worth something, but not 20%. He considered. 15, and only on commission she sources directly. Anything that comes through her store incidentally, you negotiate separately. Mabel thought about it. She might not agree. She might not, he said. But if she doesn't, you'll know she's more interested in the percentage than the arrangement, and that tells you something about what kind of partner she'll be. She wrote it down. You were good at the other work, she said. The disputes. I was, he said. There was no pride in it, but no apology either. Being good at something and it being right for you are different problems. The meeting with Vera Stanhope happened on a Wednesday in Pell's Crossing, which was a larger settlement than Red Hollow. Not a town exactly, not yet, but it was moving in that direction, with 3 streets that had actual names and a small hotel. Vera Stanhope's Dry Goods was on the main street, wider than Amos Steer's place, with a back room that functioned as an informal post for women in the community who needed repairs done quickly. Vera herself was a woman of about 50, with a pragmatic face and quick eyes. She shook Mabel's hand with a firm grip and looked at the samples Mabel had brought, a sleeve she'd reconstructed as a demonstration piece, and the pattern adjustments she'd made to the Beaumont coat, with the focused attention of someone evaluating a tool for a specific job. "You do clean work," she said. "I do," Mabel said. Vera's mouth curved slightly. "And you know you do." "I've been doing it long enough," Mabel said. "I know what good looks like." They sat down at Vera's desk in the back room, and Mabel presented her arrangement. She felt the nerves in her hands, a slight controlled tremor that she managed by keeping her hands visible and busy, pointing to the notes in her book rather than clasped in her lap. Vera listened without interrupting. When Mabel finished, Vera said, "You've put this at 15%. "Yes." "I was expecting 20. "I know," Mabel said. 15 is fair for a referral and channel arrangement. 20 would make sense if you were also providing workspace and materials. You're not." Vera looked at her. "Mrs. Adler said you were good. She didn't mention you were direct." "Mrs. Adler didn't negotiate with me," Mabel said. "She just paid me." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she made a sound that was part way between approval and amusement. 15%, she said. "On commissions I source directly. We'll work out the incidentals as they come." "That's what I was proposing," Mabel said. They shook hands again. Walking back to the wagon afterward, Mabel felt the particular sensation of something clicking into position. Not a dramatic shift, not a sudden change in the world, but the small, solid sound of a thing falling where it was supposed to fall. She'd walked into that room not knowing whether Vera Stanhope would agree or dismiss her, or offer terms so unfair that she'd have to decline them. She'd walked out with an arrangement that was almost exactly what she'd asked for. She had done that. Her own words, her own reasoning, her own willingness to hold the number, even when the other person pushed. She drove back toward Red Hollow, thinking about the building 2 doors from the feed store, and the money in her notebook, and how far off the right number still was, and how that was different from impossible. October arrived with the blunt indifference of plains weather. Not gradually, not poetically, just a Tuesday morning where the temperature had dropped 20 degrees from the week before, and the light had gone from gold to gray, and that was autumn. Mabel added a second quilt to the bed in the spare room and started wearing her heavier clothes and moved on. The workload had increased enough that she sometimes went 2 or 3 days without going out to help with the ranch work, which she felt obscurely guilty about even though Wyatt hadn't asked for her help and didn't seem to miss it. She mentioned this one evening. "I've been at the table most of this week," she said. "The Stanhope commissions are running back to back." "That's the point," he said. "I know, but—" She paused, trying to identify what was actually bothering her. "I don't want to just be in your house taking up your kitchen." He looked at her with the mild patience of someone who has had this conversation before, though they hadn't. "You're not taking up the kitchen. You're working in it. I'm also eating your food. You also cook most of it," he said. "And you replaced the 2 hens that stopped laying. And you found the rot in the barn foundation before I did, which saved me about a month of worse work later." He looked back at what he'd been doing. "You're not a guest, Mabel. I don't know what you are exactly, but you're not that." She thought about that for a moment. "What am I then?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Someone who's building something, same as me." She looked at the side of his face and the lamplight on it, and the careful way he had of saying things that were true without dressing them up. She thought about the past 3 months, about the fence line and the kitchen garden and the cornbread and the dress for Nora Adler and the notebook full of numbers and the meeting with Vera Stanhope where she'd held 15% and gotten it. "I went and looked at that building again on my last trip into town," she said. "The dressmaker's one. I talked to Gerald Kimberly just to ask about it, to know what it would take." Wyatt set down his work and looked at her. "And?" "He's not in a rush to rent it. It's been sitting. He gave me a number that's reasonable if I have steady enough work." She paused. "I think I'll have steady enough work by spring." "Spring is 4 months." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about what I'd do differently if I had a proper space. A dress form, better storage, A cutting table that doesn't fold up. She opened her notebook to a page she'd been working on. I drew it out. He leaned over and looked at the rough sketch she'd made. Not architectural, just a layout of what the space would hold and where. He looked at it for a long moment. The cutting table should be against the south wall, he said. The windows are on that side. You said yourself the light matters. She looked at the sketch. He was right. She'd put the table in the center out of instinct, but the center of that room didn't get the south light. She'd been in there twice now, and she knew that. She crossed it out and moved it. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the lamp was good, and outside the October wind was picking up, which you could hear in the way the building shifted and settled. It was not an unpleasant sound. It was a sound that meant you were inside something solid, and the outside was doing what the outside did. She was 3 commissions deep into the Stanhope arrangement, and she had 2 more waiting, and she had a building in town that she was going to rent in the spring, and she had a sketch of what it would hold, and she was sitting in a kitchen that was not hers, doing work that was entirely hers, across a table from a man who had never once told her the thing she was reaching for was too far away. She thought about Harlan Pruitt, about the particular quality of his confidence when he'd arrived in the yard, the way he'd used the community's opinion of her like a bludgeon. She thought about Red Hollow and its 60 people and their pity faces and Hetty Garland's whisper and Franklin's mother in the second pew. She was going back. Not because they'd invited her. Not because she'd been forgiven for whatever she was supposed to have done wrong by existing in the way she existed. She was going back because she had work there and a building she was going to rent and a business she was building, and she needed the town the way you need any infrastructure. Not with warmth, but as a practical fact of the place where you'd decided to plant yourself. She'd been afraid before. Not of the work, but of what it would feel like to walk back into Red Hollow and set up a shop on the main street and be visible in that specific way. To say, with every commission she took, I am here and I am good at this, and your opinion of me in that church did not settle the question of what I'm worth. She was less afraid of that now than she'd been in September. She wasn't sure exactly when the change had happened. It wasn't a single moment she could point to. It was more like 5 months of ordinary days that had added up quietly into something that held weight. She finished her current seam and cut the thread and examined the join in the lamplight. Clean and even, exactly where she'd meant it to go. She folded the piece and set it with the others and opened the next one in the pile. Outside, the October wind found its voice in the eaves, and the lamp held, and she kept working. The first snow came on a Friday in November, which was earlier than anyone wanted and later than the sky had been threatening for 2 weeks. Mabel woke to the particular silence of a world that has gone white overnight. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful so much as total. Every sound absorbed by what had fallen. She lay in bed for a moment listening to it before she got up, and then she got up and went to the window and looked out at the ranch under 4 inches of snow that was still coming down in the flat, business-like way of a storm that had not finished yet. Wyatt was already outside. She could see him through the window, a dark shape moving between the barn and the house, his breath visible in the cold. She put on her extra wool socks and her coat and went to help without being asked, because there were things that needed doing, and she'd been on this ranch long enough to know what they were. The cattle needed to be moved. Not all of them, but the 8 head that had been pastured closest to the north ridge, where the wind came off the higher ground and could put an animal in trouble faster than expected. Wyatt had already started the process by the time she got out there, pushing them south toward the closer pasture where the windbreak of old cottonwoods would cut the worst of it. She got behind the herd on the left flank without instruction and worked them the way he'd shown her in October, when he'd taken her out on a morning and explained the basic principles of moving cattle, apparently on the theory that she was going to be useful, or learn to be. She'd been skeptical of her own usefulness at the time. She was less skeptical now. She knew how to read the direction an animal was about to go before it went there, which was mostly a matter of watching the head and shoulders rather than the hind end. She knew how to move without startling them. The snow kept falling. By the time they had the cattle settled and the barn secured and the water trough dealt with, it had a skin of ice that needed breaking at the edges. They were both thoroughly cold and damp and had been working for 2 hours without stopping. Inside the kitchen, Mabel put coffee on and stood at the stove with her hands wrapped around the pot for warmth while she waited for it, which was not a technique she'd recommend but was honest about the temperature of her fingers. Wyatt came in and sat down at the table and pulled his boots off and said nothing, which was his version of being tired. She poured the coffee and sat across from him, and they both drank without talking for a while, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about this particular person. He had no need to fill silences, and so silences with him were restful rather than loaded. "The roof on the east outbuilding," she said eventually. "I know," he said. "That section above the door was already pulling loose before the snow. The weight is going to finish the job." "I know," he said again. "I'll get up there when it stops." "I can hold the ladder." He looked at her. "I know you can," he said. She drank her coffee. Outside, the snow continued its patient accumulation. "I had a letter from Gerald Kimberly," she said, "yesterday, before the snow. He wanted to know if I was still interested in the building." Wyatt looked at her over his cup. "And?" "I wrote back and told him yes, and that I expected to have the first month's rent and deposit by late February." She paused. "He said that was acceptable. He'd hold it for me until then." "Good," Wyatt said. "It means the spring timeline is real," she said, "not theoretical." "It was always real," he said. "You just needed the confirmation." She considered pushing back on that and decided he was right, so she didn't. She'd been treating the spring plan as a working probability rather than a commitment, which was her own particular self-protective habit, keeping a hand on the exit in case she needed to revise downward. Having Kimberly's word in writing had changed something. It was real now in the way that put weight in her chest, which was not dread but was adjacent to it. The particular weight of a thing you actually intend to do. "I'll need to tell people," she said. "When I open the shop, I mean. Get word out properly." "Mrs. Adler, Vera Stanhope, they already know," she said. "I mean Red Hollow, the town itself." She set her cup down. "I've been doing the Stanhope work through Pell's Crossing and the Adler referrals through the surrounding settlements, and it's been easier doing it at a distance, not having to walk into Red Hollow and set up in front of all of them." "But you're putting the shop on Main Street," he said. "2 doors from the feed store," she confirmed, "right where everyone can see it." She looked at the table. "Which is the point, I suppose. The point is to be visible." "Does that bother you?" She thought about the honest answer. "Less than it did in July," she said. "More than I'd like." She looked up at him. "I know what some of them think. I know Hetty Garland still talks. I know Franklin's mother tells people it was inevitable that no man would—" She stopped. "The things they think haven't changed." "No," he said. "But I'm going to open the shop anyway." "Yes," he said. "You are." The simplicity of it landed differently than reassurance would have. He wasn't telling her it would be fine, or that people would come around, or that she shouldn't worry. He was just agreeing with what was already true. She was going to do it. That was established. The rest was just weather. Talk. The snow was gone in 10 days, but winter had arrived definitively in its wake, and the ranch settled into its cold season rhythm. Shorter workdays outside, longer evenings, the specific intimacy of 2 people sharing a heated interior against a dark and frozen exterior. It was a different kind of time from autumn. Autumn had been busy and outward-facing, work that spread across the land. Winter was inward, slower, and there was a quality of attention to the evenings that was harder to ignore. She noticed him more in winter. That was the honest accounting of it. Not in a way she'd sought out or planned for, but in the way of something that accumulates when you are in close proximity to a person over enough time in enough different conditions. She knew his habits, the way he drank his coffee too hot and didn't seem to notice, the way he worked through a problem silently for a long time before saying anything about it, the particular set of his shoulders when something had gone wrong with the fence or the cattle versus when he was simply thinking. She knew which silences meant he was tired and which meant he was preoccupied. She knew that he laughed rarely, but that when he did, it was a real laugh, not a polite one, and it changed his whole face. She did not make much of this. She was building toward a spring that would take her back into town and into her own space and her own life, and making much of things that lived in the category of noticing seemed like a way of complicating something that didn't need to be complicated. She was a practical woman, by necessity and by nature, and she applied that practicality here. But she noticed. In December, Harlan Pruitt came back. He didn't ride in unannounced this time. He sent a letter first, which arrived on a Tuesday, and which Wyatt read without particular expression and set on the kitchen table and didn't mention until that evening. "Pruitt wants to meet," he said. Mabel looked up from her work. "About the ranch?" "About the water rights specifically." He handed her the letter, which she read. It was a more formal document than she'd expected, phrased like a legal inquiry, citing specific terminology about water access and easements that suggested Pruitt had been talking to a lawyer. "He's been talking to a lawyer," Wyatt said, confirming it. "He's claiming some kind of pre-existing right," she said, reading. "He's claiming his grandfather had an agreement with the man who originally settled this property, a verbal agreement about water access." Wyatt sat down. "Which would be, if it were true, and if it were legally recognized, which is a separate question, a significant problem. Is it true?" "I don't know," he said. "It might be. The man I bought from was 3 generations removed from the original settler. There was no paperwork." "And what does he want from the meeting?" "He says he wants to discuss an equitable resolution," Wyatt said, in the tone of a man quoting language he doesn't trust. Mabel set the letter down. "Which means he either wants the water rights formalized in his favor, or he wants to use the claim as leverage to get you to sell the property at a price he prefers." Wyatt looked at her. "Yes." "He's not actually certain his claim would hold," she said. "If he were, he wouldn't be asking to meet. He'd be filing a court action." "That's what I thought," he said. She tapped the letter. "The phrasing here, equitable resolution, that's not the language of someone with a strong legal position. That's the language of someone who wants to negotiate instead of litigate, because negotiation is cheaper and more likely to succeed." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You read legal documents?" "My father was a surveyor," she said. "Disputes about land and water were constant. I learned to read the paperwork." She paused. "You should get your own documentation in order before you meet with him. The original deed, whatever came with the purchase, any maps that show the water source. If the creek is on your land, start there. There's a county surveyor in Pell's Crossing," he said. "Make an appointment," she said, before the meeting with Pruitt." He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the one where he was registering something without making a production of it. "All right," he said. Mom. She went with him to Pell's Crossing. This was not discussed extensively beforehand. She'd mentioned she needed to go to Pell's Crossing anyway. She had 2 finished pieces for Vera Stanhope and materials to collect. And he'd said he was going Thursday, and she'd said Thursday worked, and that was the conversation. But she was there for the surveyor's office, which Wyatt had not asked her to be, and which she attended anyway, sitting in the waiting area with her Stanhope packages while he was in the back office. And then being waved in by the surveyor himself, a younger man named Dale Fitch, who had an excess of paperwork in a competent manner, when it turned out that Mabel's father's name was on 2 of the reference survey documents from the original land settlement. "Cross," Fitch said, looking at the signature on the older map. "Not a common name in these records. Any relation?" "My father," she said. Fitch looked at her with new attention. "He did solid work," he said. "These measurements have held up." She looked at her father's handwriting on the old survey map, his particular neat printing, the kind of precision that had been the best of him, and felt the complicated quiet of looking at something a dead person made that outlasted them. The water source, according to her father's survey, was entirely within the original boundary of what was now Wyatt's property. The creek entered from the northeast and crossed the east corner, the corner where Mabel had been walking the fence line since September, before exiting south. There was no notated easement, no marked access point, no indication that any agreement about outside water rights had existed at the time of the original survey. "If there was a verbal agreement," Fitch said, "it predates this document and has no legal standing that I can see. The current deed is clean." Wyatt asked 3 careful questions about what Pruitt's lawyers might argue and what the county's position would be on an unrecorded verbal easement claim from 3 generations back, and Fitch answered them with the methodical patience of a man who enjoyed being precise. In the wagon on the way back, Mabel said, "His claim won't hold." "No," Wyatt agreed, "but he might not know that yet. Or he knows it, and he's betting you don't." "That too," he said. "You should meet with him," she said, "and you should tell him what you found. Not aggressively, just Lay it out. Make him understand that the legal path is a long one that won't go his way. And if he decides to take the legal path anyway, then you have the documentation and he doesn't. She looked at the road ahead. But he won't. Men like Pruitt don't spend money on litigation when the outcome isn't certain. It was always about the path of least resistance. Once that path is clearly you standing firm, he'll look for water somewhere else. Wyatt drove for a while without speaking. Then, "You're good at this. Reading people who are trying to move around you?" She looked at him. "I've had practice." He glanced at her briefly, and she thought she saw something in that look that was more than acknowledgement, something quieter and more careful, the look of a person who is listening to more than the words. She turned back to the road. The meeting with Pruitt happened at the end of January, in the front room of the county commissioner's office in Red Hollow, which had been suggested by Pruitt and agreed to by Wyatt because a public setting suited him fine. Mabel was not at the meeting. She had not asked to be, and Wyatt had not suggested it, and she'd spent the morning it was happening at the kitchen table working through a complicated piece of French seaming on a coat for a new commission from Stanhope's network. She heard about it when he came back in the early afternoon, snow on his boots and the contained quality of a man who had accomplished what he'd set out to do. "It's done," he said. She put her needle down. "Done how?" "He withdrew the claim." He hung up his coat. "He tried a few angles first. I let him finish, then laid out what Fitch found." He paused. He wasn't surprised. He was testing how much I knew. "I thought so," she said. "He made one more offer on the property, higher than before." He poured coffee from the pot on the stove. "I said no." She looked at him. "He'll come back eventually." "Maybe," Wyatt said, "but not for a while. And the next time he'll know the documentation is in order." He sat down. "He's not a stupid man. He miscalculated how much research I'd done." She picked her needle back up. "Or how much research you'd had help doing." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That too." There was something in the brief silence that followed that she let lie where it was. She went back to the French seam. February arrived, and with it a change in the quality of the days. Still cold, still short, but carrying in the occasional afternoon a faint suggestion of something that would eventually be different. The light had a new angle to it, almost imperceptible, but she'd been watching the light on this property for 7 months, and she could feel it. She was 6 weeks from the building on Main Street. The commissions were solid. She had 4 in progress, 2 more waiting, and Vera Stanhope had written to say she'd had 3 separate inquiries in January from women who'd been referred by existing customers, which was the particular metric that mattered, because it meant her reputation was generating its own momentum without her having to push it. She wrote the number down in her notebook and looked at it and then kept working. On a Sunday afternoon, Wyatt found her at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a spread of figures she'd been reorganizing. "You're going over the numbers again," he said. "They keep being right," she said. "I keep checking." He sat down across from her and looked at the notebook. "They are right," he said. "You've been over this enough." "I know." She pressed her fingers against the page. "It's not about the numbers. It's about what they mean." She looked up. "I've been poor my whole life. Not desperately poor, but close enough. Always calculating what I could and couldn't do, what I could and couldn't want. And now I'm looking at figures that say I can do this, and some part of me keeps waiting for the thing that makes them wrong." He was quiet. "That's probably familiar to you," she said. "In a different form," he said. "The ranch." "The ranch," he agreed, 4 years of it being one bad season away from not working. He looked at the table. "It stops feeling that way eventually. The thing you built starts to feel like it has its own weight, like it's real enough to push back." She thought about that. "When did it stop for you?" He considered. "About the time I fixed the barn roof properly," he said. "Not patched it, actually fixed it." He paused. "When you stop working around the problems you inherited and start building what you actually want, the ground feels different." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm almost there," she said. Not asking, stating. "Almost," he agreed. The week before she was due to sign the rental agreement with Gerald Kimberly, Wyatt built her a cutting table. She didn't know he was doing it. He'd been working in the barn on something he hadn't described, which was not unusual. He had ongoing projects of his own that he didn't narrate. She'd come in one evening to find him in the main part of the barn, which he'd swept clear of the usual debris, working with planks she hadn't seen before. "What's that?" she said. "Table," he said. She looked at the dimensions. "That's wide." 60 inches, he said. "You said a cutting table needed to be wide enough to lay full fabric without it hanging over." She had said that. In October, when she'd been describing what the shop would need, she hadn't known he'd registered the specific dimension. She stood in the barn doorway looking at the table taking shape. Solid construction, the legs square and braced. The top from planks he'd planed to a flat surface that would serve better than most things she could have bought. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to find something in town. This'll be better than what you'd find in town," he said, without conceit. He was probably right. She stood watching him work for a minute. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since October," he said. She had no immediate response to that. She stood in the barn and looked at the man who had let her land on his property and had given her a lamp and fixed a table and not asked her to explain herself or be grateful on any particular schedule. And something moved in her chest that was not the almost laugh and not the particular satisfaction of a good seam, but was its own thing entirely. "Wyatt," she said. He looked up. "I'm going to say something," she said, "and I want you to let me finish before you say anything practical." He set down the plane. "All right." She came into the barn and stood near the table and looked at him squarely, which was the only way she knew how to do this kind of thing, directly, without hedging. "I'm going to open the shop in March," she said, "and I'm going to be in town most days, and I'm going to build the business I've been building, and all of that is true and real, and it's mine." She paused. "But I've also been here for 7 months, and this?" She gestured vaguely at the barn and the house beyond it and the land and everything else. "This has been the most useful and most honest and most real that I've felt since before my father died. Maybe longer." She looked at him. "I don't know what you've been thinking about any of that. I'd like to know." He was quiet for a long enough time that she wondered if she'd misread everything. Then, "I've been thinking about it since October," he said. "The table," she said. "Not just the table." She held his gaze. "Then say what you mean," she said. "You're usually better at saying what you mean than most people." He was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not absent, but looking for the right shape of words. "I've been alone on this ranch for 4 years," he said, "and I didn't mind it, mostly. I'd chosen it." He looked at the table he'd been building. "And then you were here, and the ranch was better, and the evenings were different, and I was better, in ways I wasn't expecting." He looked at her. "I'm not good at wanting things. I've made a practice of not wanting things I might not get." "Neither am I," she said. "I know," he said, "but I'm trying to learn differently," she said. "That's what the shop is. That's what the notebook full of numbers is, deciding to want something and reach for it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Stay." It was one word. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without performance, as if it were simply the accurate version of what he'd been thinking. "At the ranch," she said. "Keep the shop," he said. "Open it in March. Build it into whatever it's going to be." He paused. "But come back here. Not as a guest and not as a practical arrangement. As someone who's here." She thought about the spare room and the cracked mirror and the night she'd arrived with her wildflowers and her ruined plans. And she thought about the fence line and the kitchen garden and 7 months of evenings and everything she'd become in this place that she hadn't been before. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I have opinions about how things should be done, and I keep irregular hours, and I will always think I know where the weeds are coming from." "I know," he said. "You've been doing it for 7 months." She looked at him. "You're also not easy to live with," she said. "You don't explain things, and you work before dawn, and you have a horse named Esther that you talk to more than you talk to most people." "Fair," he said. The lamp in the barn was the better one she'd moved out there in November for his evening work, and it threw a warm and specific light across the table he'd been building for her for reasons he'd kept to himself since October. Outside, the February night was cold and clear in the way that only happens when it hasn't snowed in a while. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again. I'll stay. He didn't say anything more, which she expected. He picked up the plane and went back to working on the table, and she stood in the barn for another minute watching him. And then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her notebook full of figures and felt the weight of everything she'd built these 7 months settle into something that felt less like a station and more like a beginning. She opened the notebook to a new page. She wrote March, shop on Main Street, cross alterations and dressmaking. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she wrote the name the way she'd been thinking it privately for weeks, not as a fantasy, not as a plan, just as a thing that had been true in the air of the ranch for longer than either of them had said it out loud. She crossed the room and started on supper, which was a practical thing that needed doing, and she did it with the particular steadiness of a woman who had spent 7 months learning the difference between surviving and building, and who had finally, without ceremony, chosen the second one. The cutting table arrived on Main Street on the second Saturday of March, in the back of Wyatt's wagon, wrapped in canvas against the morning cold. It took both of them and Amos Steer's youngest boy to get it through the front door of the shop, because Wyatt had built it with the intention of it lasting 30 years rather than with the intention of it fitting easily through door frames. There was a brief, undignified moment where it was wedged at an angle, and nobody's arm was at the right position, and Mabel said a word that made Amos's boy go quiet. And then they got it through and set it against the south wall where she'd planned it since October. And it sat there with the immovable satisfaction of something that had been made specifically for that purpose and had arrived. She put her hands flat on the surface. The wood was smooth. Wyatt had spent 2 evenings in the last week of February finishing it properly, which she'd watched without comment because he'd have found comment intrusive. It was the right height. The light from the south windows fell across it exactly as she'd hoped. "Well," Amos's boy said, rubbing his arm, "that's a heavy table." "Yes," Mabel said. "It is." She looked around the room. It was not a large space, but it was hers. The front room with its south-facing windows, the back workroom with its storage, the small alcove that she'd decided would hold the dress form, and the fitting area. She'd spent the last 2 weeks cleaning it, patching a crack in the plaster near the ceiling, repainting the front window frame a dark green that she liked because it was the color she liked rather than the color that was expected. She'd made a small sign, Cross Alterations and Dressmaking, which was hanging now above the door, painted by her own hand in letters that were not perfectly even, but were clean and readable and hers. It was not a grand opening. She had not planned a ceremony or sent formal announcements. She'd told Vera Stanhope, who told the women in her network. She told Mrs. Adler, who told her quilting circle. She told Amos Steer, who told people incidentally, in the way that storekeepers do. And she'd put the sign up, and the door would open on Monday morning, and whatever happened after that would happen. Wyatt helped her carry the smaller things in. The dress form, the storage boxes, the rod she'd hung along the back wall of the workroom for finished pieces in progress. He moved things where she told him to and didn't suggest alternatives unless she asked, which was a quality she'd come to understand was specific to him and not general to men. When everything was in, she stood in the center of the front room and looked at it. "It needs a rug," she said. "Probably," he said from the doorway. "And the light in this back room is still not right. I need to put a mirror on the east wall to redirect it." "I can do that next week," he said. She turned and looked at him in the doorway. The familiar shape of him, the careful attention in his face. She thought about the first morning she'd ever seen him clearly, in the back pew of a church where she'd gone to do the bravest and most mistaken thing she'd ever planned, and how he'd said, "You don't have to stand there if you don't want to," and how that sentence had been the beginning of an entirely different year than the one she'd been living before it. "Thank you," she said. "For the table," he said, meaning that the word covered more than the table, but that the table was a reasonable container for it. "For the table," she agreed. "Was." Monday came with the particular high-stakes quiet of a first day. She was at the shop before 7, which was not when customers came, but was when she needed to be there, sorting and organizing and resorting things she'd already organized, because her hands needed to be busy while her mind managed the fact of what she was doing. At 8:30, Vera Stanhope arrived in person from Pell's Crossing, which Mabel hadn't expected, carrying a tin of tea and a matter-of-fact expression. "I was in the area," Vera said, setting the tin on the work table. "You drove 20 miles to be in the area," Mabel said. "I wanted to see the space." Vera looked around the front room with the appraising eye she brought to everything. She stopped at the cutting table. She put her hand on the surface the same way Mabel had on Saturday. "Someone built this for you." "Yes," Mabel said. "Good craftsmanship," Vera said, in the tone of someone noting a fact that has implications beyond the fact itself. She looked at Mabel briefly. "The green on the window frame is good." "I thought so," Mabel said. "Most women would have done it white." "I know," Mabel said. Vera made the sound that meant approval and poured tea from the tin into the cups Mabel had brought, and they sat in the front room while the town of Red Hollow went about its Monday morning business outside the window. A few people looked in as they passed, some curious, some with the carefully neutral expression of people who were gathering information for later deployment. Mabel saw Hetty Garland stop on the opposite boardwalk and look at the shop for a long moment before moving on. She did not go to the window. She drank her tea. Her first customer came at 10:15. A woman she didn't know, referred by someone in Vera's network, who needed 2 skirts let out at the waist and a coat lining replaced. Mabel took the work without ceremony, measured and noted everything, gave the woman a price and a completion date. The woman seemed slightly surprised by the efficiency of it, as if she'd expected more conversation or more apology. "You'll have them ready Friday?" the woman said. "Wednesday," Mabel said. "I work faster than I usually quote." The woman left looking satisfied in the way of someone who has gotten more than they expected. After she left, Vera raised her cup. "Wednesday," she said. "I don't like people waiting," Mabel said. She had 3 more customers before noon. Not all of them became immediate commissions. One was clearly a reconnaissance mission. A woman who came in, looked at everything, asked several questions about pricing and capacity, and left without committing to anything. Mabel recognized the type. She'd be back within a week with something that needed doing urgently. By the time she closed at 5 o'clock on that first Monday, she had 5 commissions in hand and 2 definite inquiries, and 1 piece she'd agreed to look at when the customer brought it in. She sat in the back room after the door was closed and wrote everything in the notebook, and the numbers were not dramatic, but they were real, and they were hers. And she sat with them for a while before she put the notebook away. Wyatt came for her at 5:30 with the wagon. She'd told him he didn't need to. She could drive herself. And he'd said he was coming into town anyway, which might have been true and might have been consideration wearing the costume of practicality, and she'd decided not to investigate which. He was waiting outside, and he looked at the sign above the door when she came out, with the particular expression of someone seeing something they've been thinking about as an abstraction and are now looking at as a fact. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. 5 commissions. "First day," he said. "First day," she agreed. She climbed up onto the wagon, and they rode out of town in the late afternoon light, which was doing the March thing of lasting fractionally longer than it had a month ago, the first real evidence that the year was moving in the direction of warmth again. The road was still frozen in the ruts from winter, but there was a softness at the edges of it that was new. She was tired in a way that felt earned rather than depleted. There was a difference she'd come to understand. The exhaustion that came from spending yourself on things that didn't give anything back, and the exhaustion that came from spending yourself on things that did. 7 months ago, she hadn't known that difference in her body. She did now. Hetty Garland looked at the shop, she said, not particularly directing it at anything. "Did she come in?" Wyatt said. "No." He drove for a moment. "She will." Mabel looked at the road. "I know," she said. "She'll need something done, and she'll come to me because I'm the closest and the best, and the price will be right, and she'll manage the contradiction of using my services while also having a particular version of me in her head." She paused. "People do that." "They do," he said. "I've decided I don't care," she said. "Not about Hetty specifically. I'll take her money and do good work, and that'll be the whole extent of my relationship with what she thinks." She looked at the hills coming up ahead, the east ridge that she'd been walking the fence below for months. "I cared about it for a long time. What people thought. Whether they approved. I kept adjusting myself to make the picture easier for them." "I know," he said. "It's exhausting," she said. "Not dramatically exhausting. Just a constant low-level drain, like a fence that's always pulling slightly wrong." He glanced at her. The fence metaphor had landed where she'd aimed it. You stop noticing how tired it makes you, she said, because it's been there your whole life. And then one day you stop doing it and you realize you have so much more room, just room in yourself. They rode for a while without talking. The light was going orange at the edges. I've been thinking about something, she said. All right, he said. The wedding. She said it plainly because she was a practical woman and there was no useful way to circle around it. I don't want a ceremony in that church. I don't want 60 people assembled to watch me do anything that significant again, with their faces and their various opinions. Wyatt was quiet. But I'd like it to be real, she said. Official. Not because I need it for them, but because I'd like it for myself, to have the thing actually done and recorded. Justice of the Peace in Pell's Crossing, he said. Dale Fitch's office is in the same building. She looked at him. That would do. I'd want Vera Stanhope there, he said, and Mrs. Adler. She was surprised by this, by the fact that he had people he wanted at the thing. It told her something about the months she'd watched him and still managed to not fully see. Yes, she said, and Dottie Marsh. She was kind when she didn't have to be. End of March, he said. End of March, she said. He nodded. That was apparently the extent of the planning conversation, which suited her. She thought about the church on a Tuesday morning in July, and the 60 faces, and the question she'd been unable to answer standing in the middle of that aisle. She thought about Franklin Holt and the stage out of town, and the specific, useful lesson of choosing the wrong person. That wanting something didn't mean you'd aimed it correctly, and that the aim could be corrected without the wanting having been wrong. She'd wanted to matter to someone. She just needed to wait for the someone to be a person worth mattering to. The last week of March in Red Hollow was mud season, which was the least romantic time of year on the plains by any measure. The snow gone, the ground not yet firm, everything brown and soft and smelling of the particular combination of earth and livestock that defined early spring. Mabel thought, driving into Pell's Crossing on a Friday morning, that if she'd been the kind of woman who needed the setting to be beautiful, this would have been a disappointment. She was not that kind of woman. She was wearing the blue dress. She'd taken it out of the bottom drawer a week ago and looked at it with the honest eyes she now brought to most things. It was a good dress. She'd made it well. It had been sitting in a drawer for 8 months because of what it had been intended for, and it seemed to her now that that was a waste, that the dress had done nothing wrong, and that wearing it somewhere it had never been worn was not patching over the past, but simply using a thing that was still useful. She'd altered it slightly. Not much. The dress had been fine. Just a small adjustment at the sleeve where the button had been loose since the morning of the burned biscuits, and a tiny let-out at the shoulder where months of fence work and garden labor and the particular physicality of ranch life had broadened her frame in ways she'd only noticed recently. The dress fit her now the way clothes should fit, not managing her body, not accommodating it apologetically, but simply wearing it. Vera Stanhope was waiting outside the county building in Pell's Crossing, wearing a dark gray coat that suited her. Mrs. Adler stood beside her with the focused, practical expression of a woman who had made a decision to be happy about something and intended to follow through. Dottie Marsh arrived 2 minutes late, slightly out of breath, and gave Mabel an impulsive hug that Mabel accepted without stepping back from. Wyatt was already inside. He was wearing a clean jacket she hadn't seen before, dark wool, well-fitted, and she suspected it had been made or at minimum altered by someone who knew what they were doing, though she hadn't asked. He looked at her when she came through the door, and the particular quality of his attention in that moment was not different from how he usually looked at her, which was, she'd realized gradually over months, a look of complete and uncomplicated regard. He looked at her the same way he looked at everything that mattered to him, steadily, fully, without qualification. Dale Fitch performed the ceremony with the brisk competence of a man who had done this before and respected the thing he was doing. The words were simple and legal, and Mabel said them clearly and without hesitation, which surprised her. She'd expected at least some tremor in her voice, some ambush of feeling at the wrong moment, but she said the words with the same directness she brought to everything now, and meant them in the same way. And Wyatt said them in his particular voice that carried without effort, and it was done. Vera Stanhope made a sound that was not quite crying and was clearly embarrassed about it. Mrs. Adler patted her arm. Dottie said quietly, "Oh, that was good," as if she'd been watching a story resolve correctly. They had lunch at the small hotel on Pell's Crossing's main street, all five of them crowded around a table that was not quite large enough, which created the involuntary warmth of people pressed closer than formality would normally permit. Vera ordered something impractical and ate it without apology. Mrs. Adler told a story about her husband's proposal that involved a runaway horse and a muddy creek, and was apparently a warning about the unpredictability of significant moments, though it ended well. Dottie laughed too loudly twice and didn't seem bothered by it. Wyatt ate steadily and said little, but he said it at the right moments, and once he put his hand over Mabel's on the table, in the unceremonious way of someone who is not performing a gesture but simply doing a thing, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they stayed like that for a while without remark. On the drive back, she thought about what she would have said 7 months ago if someone had described this day to her. She thought about the woman on the church steps with the crushed wildflowers, and what that woman would have made of the scene she'd just come from. Not the ceremony specifically. The dress, the small gathering, the lunch. What that woman would have made of being held in regard, of having built something, of driving home to a ranch that was hers, in a way the word home was supposed to mean, and so rarely did. She thought that woman would have believed it was possible. She'd always believed, underneath everything, that it was possible. She'd just been afraid that it wasn't possible for her specifically, that there was some categorical exception she fell under. Too large, too plain, too lacking in whatever quality the world seemed to require before it offered certain things. It turned out the exception wasn't categorical. It was just a matter of who you were standing next to when you needed to leave a room. Spring came, and then summer, and the shop on Main Street became what she'd planned it to be. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in the accumulating way of things built correctly. She was busy. Not overwhelmed, which was a distinction she'd learned to guard. There was a version of success that became its own trap, more work than could be done well, and she wasn't interested in that version. She hired a girl from the edge of town 2 days a week, a 15-year-old named Lou who had good hands and was learning quickly, and she paid her fairly because anything less was the kind of decision that seemed convenient in the short term and was always a mistake eventually. Red Hollow adjusted to her, which was not the same as welcoming her, but was its own kind of acknowledgement. The women who had whispered after the wedding that wasn't brought their dresses to her, one by one, not with apology. She hadn't expected apology and wouldn't have known what to do with it, but with the pragmatic recognition that she was skilled and reliable and knew how to keep a confidence about the size alterations that suggested a winter of more eating than expected. She served them well. She said nothing she didn't need to say. She took their money and did good work and let the quality of the work be the whole argument. Hetty Garland came in on a Tuesday in June with a coat that needed new buttons and the wary expression of a woman who had been told she would be treated normally and wasn't sure she believed it. Mabel treated her normally. When Hetty left, she had her buttons, she had a receipt, and she had stood in a room with Mabel Cross for 20 minutes without anything being said that needed to be said. She would come back. Mabel knew she would come back because the work was good and the price was fair, and Hetty Garland was ultimately a practical woman who cared about the quality of her clothing, and that would win out over whatever she'd been whispering about for the past year. That was all right. Mabel had stopped requiring more from people than they were able to give, not because she'd lowered her expectations of what she deserved, but because she'd separated what she deserved from what she could expect from any particular person. Those were different questions, and she'd spent too much of her life conflating them. Franklin Holt's cousin Amos ran the dry goods store well, and she had no feeling about Franklin one way or the other that required management. She'd loved the idea of him more than she'd loved him. She could see this clearly now, from the distance of a year. She'd loved the idea of being chosen, of having the question of her worth settled by someone else's declaration. She understood why she'd wanted that, and she didn't judge her younger self for it, but she also understood now that it was the wrong way to settle the question. The question of your own worth was not answerable by anyone else's opinion of you. It was answerable only by what you decided to build and how you decided to build it. She'd built something. Not perfectly. Not without the wrong turns and the burned biscuits, in the days when she sat in the back room of the shop and looked at a seam she'd done carelessly because she was tired and had to decide whether to leave it or redo it. She always redid it, not because she was above imperfection, but because she'd learned the difference between the imperfections you accepted and the ones you didn't, and that distinction was actually the whole of the craft. In August, a year after she'd ridden out to the Granger Ranch in a wedding dress with crushed wildflowers in her hand, Mabel Cross. She had kept her name on the shop sign because it was the name people knew her work by, and Wyatt had no opinion about it except that she should do what made sense, sat on the porch of the ranch house at the end of a long workday and looked out at the valley. The kitchen garden was full and orderly. She'd expanded it in spring, added rows of things she'd actually wanted. Tomatoes, though they were difficult in this climate, and a section of herbs that the kitchen had needed for years. The onions, as Wyatt had predicted, came back without instruction. The tomatoes were improbable and stubborn, and she was going to get a reasonable harvest out of them purely by refusing to accept that she wasn't. Wyatt came out and sat down beside her. He'd been with the cattle most of the afternoon. There were 31 head now. The herd slowly and deliberately expanded, each addition a decision made carefully rather than ambitiously. He smelled like work. She probably did too. Lou did the Pemberton alterations by herself today, she said. I checked them. They were right. She's getting there, he said. She's already there on the simpler work, Mabel said. Another 6 months and I can trust her with the larger pieces. He looked out at the valley. You're thinking about taking more commissions. I'm thinking about what the work looks like in a year, she said. 2 years. She pulled her knees up. There's a woman in Eastbridge who's been writing to me. She does textile importing, and she wants someone reliable for finished goods, not alterations, original pieces, dresses, coats. She'd place orders and I'd fill them. That's a different scale, he said. I know, she said. I'm not certain I want it. It might be too much of what I don't like about the work and not enough of what I do. She looked at the hills. I like the fitting. I like the back and forth of making something fit a specific person. Filling orders isn't that. Then probably don't, he said. Probably not, she agreed. But it's worth knowing the door is there. He nodded. She looked at his profile against the evening sky. The familiar shape of it. The particular patience he brought to whatever was in front of him, which had been the thing she'd needed most when she hadn't known yet that she needed it. She thought about what it meant. The kind of life that didn't resolve into a triumph, but into a practice. Every day a continuation rather than an ending. The seams you redid, the cattle you moved in the snow, the notebook you kept and checked and updated and kept checking. The fence line you walked twice a week, not because you expected to find disaster, but because staying ahead of problems was how things stayed standing. People talked about wanting a good life as if it were a destination, a place you arrived and then stopped traveling. She understood now that it wasn't that. It was more like the fence line. You walked it, you checked it. When something was pulling wrong, you fixed it rather than working around it. And the thing you built over time through ordinary repeated attention became something with its own weight, something that could push back. She had not arrived anywhere, she was in the middle of it. That turned out to be the whole point. The tomatoes are going to make it, she said. I had my doubts, he said. I know you did, she said. They made it anyway. He turned his head and looked at her, and the look was the one she'd been receiving for a year now, complete, uncomplicated, fully present. She looked back. Outside, the August evening was warm and extravagant with stars, and the valley held the last of the day's light in the particular way of this specific piece of land, which she had walked and worked and come to know, the way you come to know places that become yours, not through inheritance, but through the sustained daily act of staying. She stayed. That was the choice that had made everything else possible. Not one dramatic decision, not a single act of courage, but the ordinary repeated choice. To stay, to work, to reach for the thing rather than waiting to be certain it was safe. She'd been so afraid before of reaching wrong, of being seen reaching and getting nothing and having everyone witness the failure of it. But you reached wrong sometimes. Franklin Holt had been a wrong reach and she'd survived it, and she'd learned from it. And it had led, by the strange and unplanned logic of real life, to exactly where she was sitting tonight. There was no clean lesson in that, no tidy moral to carry away. Only this, that the reaching itself had been right, even when the aim was wrong, because a woman who stopped reaching stopped building, and a woman who stopped building stopped being herself. Mabel Cross had spent too many years making herself smaller in every way that wasn't physical, trying to take up less space in a world that had strong opinions about how much space she deserved. She had stopped doing that. It had not made her perfect or her life uncomplicated or the people around her suddenly generous in ways they hadn't been. It had simply made her present, fully in her own life, doing her own work, carrying what she cared about without apology, building what she wanted to build in the time she had to build it. The stars continued above the valley. The tomatoes were going to make it. She put her hand on Wyatt's arm and he covered her hand with his, and they sat in the warm dark of their ordinary, extraordinary life. And it was enough. More than enough. It was the whole thing, exactly as it was.